Well met, everyone. I am Rich the Lich. Today I want to talk a little bit about three locations, three maps, three very famous worlds. Middle-earth, Azeroth, World of Warcraft, of course, and the worlds of Elder Scrolls, specifically Skyrim. The catalyst for this video, just a quick ramble here. I was reading on some forums and someone had mentioned, they said something to the effect of how cool Oblivion is, and I think it's more Elder Scrolls Online, that world, that game, and why that should be brought over into the 5th edition game space. And I understand for especially those that are new to the hobby, how appealing it can be when you're sitting back and you've just read something interesting, some interesting work of fantasy, or maybe you've watched a movie recently, such as a Gladiator, a Braveheart, Peter Jackson's Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, so on and so forth. And you kind of think, man, that was a cool scene. That was neat. I love the way they portrayed that character. I'd love it if D&D or if WotC made that world, because that's a cool world. So what I kind of want to maybe caution you on, and these are, of course, just thoughts, my opinions. Whatever gets you excited, do that. Play in that world. I want to kind of caution you on how you need to create some separation between what have been generally accepted and regarded as the best worlds in fantasy. The things, the tried and true, the things we all know. Whether you're talking Hyborian Age from Conan, and that character in and of itself, Conan. You've got, of course, the granddaddy of them all, Middle-earth, and how iconic everything is in that world, from the villain, Sauron, bosses, the orcs, the goblins, the portrayal of elves, so on and so forth. The detail that went into creating languages and such. You've got Narnia, you have Azeroth, you've got, no pun intended, a world of resources to pull from. Then you've got the work of very well-known authors. R.A. Salvatore's works. Yes, I know he's created a lot of stuff in Forgotten Realms, which has been established as a official D&D setting, but you've got his works. You have the works of Patrick Rothfuss, Joe Abercrombie, Neil Gaiman, whoever your favorite fantasy author is, Brandon Sanderson, and the way he weaves through his own magic systems and his own worlds of interest. Dune, of course, Arrakis, and sandworms, and all this other stuff, right? So you have all of these things where there's iconic worlds, very impactful characters, there's a lot going on, a lot of detail, and it would almost seem like a sort of like a no-brainer of why not bring that into a fantasy game? But there's a difference between, and I talk about this constantly, if it's to sound a little bit corny, with ROLL play and ROLE play, there's a big difference between being able to sort of sit back with your cup of coffee, as is often the case with me, and just read some good story, some good narrative, good lore. Look at a cool map. Watch a good movie that inspires. In the creative realm, not just specific to fantasy, right? It could be Blade Runner, it could be Fifth Element, Star Wars, something a little more sci-fi-esque, Aliens. But of course, it could be Dragon Slayer and Princess Bride and Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring. But there's a difference between sitting back and just enjoying that media and consuming that content with your cup of coffee, or perhaps it's Mountain Dew and Doritos, or maybe even a bit of brandy and scotch with your cigar. Okay? There's a difference between that and the immediacy and gameplay crunch of roll initiative, roll some dice, let's get to the table. The other thing is, oftentimes when we're reading these awesome novels by these fantasy authors that are creating their own worlds, or we're watching these movies, yes, you might be watching the movies with your family and friends, but it is a solo, sort of isolated experience. You can take all of that media, all of that inspiration, and funnel it through your own creative output, or input, I should say, and weave through that alone. But yet, when you bring it to the table, inevitably, because you're playing with other players and other real-life people that might have a different, they may have interpreted that media differently than you. And therefore, what's going to happen is they might just kind of shit on your inspiration. They may not be as excited about something that you are. They may be super excited about something that you're not excited about at all, or something you're really excited about. They're kind of down in the dumps and they don't think that was a cool scene. And that is not the most memorable part of Middle-earth to them, and so on and so forth. Right? So be careful. And a good way that I want to kind of drive home this point very quickly of creating that separation is showing you how expectation, and I think more importantly, why just because something is good in novel format, sitting back and just enjoying awesome fantasy content, it doesn't mean that it translates well into the D&D space. So the quick short answer to any question of why wouldn't WotC make Elder Scrolls Online, that world setting, right? The worlds of Oblivion and Skyrim and such. Why wouldn't they transfer all of World of Warcraft into 5th edition? They've done these things, right? There's been D20 systems of many, many different worlds and pre-published settings and whatnot. Yes, oftentimes you have a big licensing issue and things like this, but you don't need all of Westeros and Game of Thrones to be brought into the 5th edition game space. And the other thing that I would caution against is, as a DM, as a creator, make your own world or use some pre-published established stuff. Don't try and take everything that's in Westeros and Game of Thrones. That's a little unwieldy anyway, especially if you're new to world building, and try and encapsulate that and crunch that down into the system of 5th edition. It will never translate well, and I want to illustrate 3 specific worlds and settings and show you how there's a disconnect there. And when there's a disconnect, that means if you sat down at the table and played D&D 5th edition in these worlds, you're going to notice how it doesn't quite live up to the nostalgia or the hype or your expectation. So let's start with the granddaddy of them all, the realm of Middle-earth. Of course, by none other than Tolkien. I am positive if you're watching this channel and you're a fan of similar hobbies, D&D, you have either read or you've watched Lord of the Rings. You know Middle-earth. It's par for the course, okay? Let's just look to the Peter Jackson movies because that's the easiest thing to pull from a visual. We can many of us can relate in the same way. Many of us have read the books, but we've maybe, depending on what time in our life we read them, if we read them once a year on the year, or we last read them when they came out, as a book report in 8th grade 27 years ago. We may have a different interpretation of how we translated that stuff through our own creative senses. Whereas watching Peter Jackson, we can all kind of relate when we talk about the CGI of the Hobbit Smaug was outstanding. The dragon was very well done. Benedict Cumberbatch's voice work was incredible, right? Smaug, Gollum, Andy Serkis won an Oscar for that. Things like this. So let's lean a little more into the visual elements and what sparked from Peter Jackson's Middle-earth. And the one sort of theme or item that I want to focus on is detail. And showing you how the detail of Tolkien's work doesn't translate at the table. Your elves, your DM, you decide to bring Middle-earth to the table. Okay, as I said, especially Middle-earth, since it's so iconic and famous, that has been done in various editions of D&D. There may even be, I don't know, an independent studio third party outside of WotC that has already created, officially on the shelf that you can buy, Middle-earth for within 5th edition D&D, right? Like, here's how to make a hobbit, quote-unquote, halfling, with the 5th edition rule set, right? But you're playing hobbits from the Shire and so on. So it may have already been done. But here's what it might look like. Tolkien's level of detail on elves, the storyline of the elves, right? Get outside of just the movies and go into the books. Remember what you've seen by Orlando Bloom and Evangeline Lilly, right? The elves in the Hobbit series and Fellowship of the Ring. Their portrayal, the way they looked, the way they talked, spoke, how they performed, how they acted, how badass Legolas was, right? Then go into the Silmarillion and Tolkien's old notes. Tolkien created languages. Like, linguists have said they are legit languages. They can function as a language, right? They have all the details that would be required to study and understand that language. Your DM is going to come to the table with whatever elves, because they took it a little further than just, I'm inspired by Tolkien's elves and his efforts, therefore I'm going to create my own elven race. No, if you try and come to the table and create Middle-earth, your elves, confined within the barriers and borders of what 5th edition rule set and system says, are never going to live up to the standard that Tolkien set forth in the creation of his elves, and the detail of the world that moves in and out of that, and the history, and the ages, and how far back that goes. Frankly, going back as far as Númenóreans and the First Age and all this other stuff, and how far Tolkien's timeline is of Middle-earth, I would be bored to tears playing in that world. There's a lot of narrative and a lot of sit back, again, with my cup of coffee and just read and be inspired. But the crunch at the table, there's not a lot of fun there for me. There's just nothing that I can get excited about. I don't have exact, I talk about this all the time, little bullet points that I can poke at and say, okay, cool story. What can my character do? I have a level 2 barbarian. I'm looking to get a magic axe. What do I do? Where do I go? What does the Númenóreans have to do with where I'm at right now in this little podunk village outside of the Shire? I'm near Bree. Can I go somewhere in Bree? What do I fight in that forest where in the movie Gandalf met with the hobbits? Things like this, right? So, detail. Tolkien's level of detail in the creation of that world, I'm assuming, this came out, he wrote this 20-something years, he was probably brainstorming it well back in World War I, right? From his experiences and stuff like that of life. But if it released in 1952 or whatever, this is 20-something years before D&D had ever come out. So I don't think Tolkien was creating the detail and nuance of Middle-earth, fantastical and related or not, orcs and elves and goblins. He wasn't creating this thinking through the headspace of how does that stat-wise play out on my character sheet? What bonus action does that give me? So because of that, that detail doesn't translate. So don't try and do it. Okay? I can go on this one forever. I can pick one map and talk about it for 3 hours. Next, let's talk about Skyrim. Okay? Skyrim. So here it can get a little more one-to-one or a little more relatable because we are dealing with a game, right? I'm looking at the map of Skyrim. This is awesome, made by someone named Game Banshee. So this spoilers here, right? It's showing the major areas, but all of the different locations that you'll discover as you wander through the map. But for those that have played Skyrim or any of the Elder Scrolls game, it doesn't have to be Skyrim specific, but let's lean into kind of the Northern Viking-esque Norse, real cold, okay? Icewind Dale, right? Things like this. So yes, you're dealing with a game, right? So there is going to be a little more relatable because you're dealing with that sense of pacing, right? That sort of timing and that narrative. It needs to be something that you can push on screen with buttons or click on your mouse and move around. And what do you see when you turn your character? That translates a little better than Tolkien's story and novel format because when you're playing D&D, as you turn left and right as you would in a video game, it's the DM's job to explain what you see left and right. You know what I mean? So yes, it does translate, but the sort of theme, the one word that I want to kind of lean into is quite simply gameplay. And more to the point, the sort of, I guess maybe having a bit of an understanding of design 101 of creating game docs when you're making a video game, as would have been made with Skyrim and the large team involved in that, versus you as a DM sitting at home in prep time, creating a cool adventure and scenario for your players to run through in tonight's 5th edition game. Let's take a look at Whiterun, right? I believe that, yeah, that's what it is. I think that's the first place. When you leave in Skyrim and you get out of the kind of prison area and you get out into the open for the first time and it pops that quest up on screen, Whiterun is where you basically go to get the initial dragon quest to go find your Fus Ro Dah, right? And start you on that path, the main storyline. Yes, you can do like me and veer off to the west for 5 hours, no joke, just picking flowers until you run into random things on the road. But let's say Whiterun. But then what happens is I'm excited. I played that. I played through Whiterun. I remember what that was like. I'm inspired by that. But I'm taking the inspiration a little too far. And now what I want to do is I actually want to create something in my D&D game that makes it feel like that. And therein lies a little bit of the cautionary points. Be careful with trying to emulate that feeling. And I think most importantly, when we talk about gameplay, my gameplay in Skyrim is isolated. Sure, someone can be over my shoulder watching, as my son was when the game first came out in 2011. I might be running through it, and he may have some comments. Ooh, Dad, can you turn left? Can you look here? Can you click on, ooh, fight that. What happens if you hit this? Shoot there. Whatever. But for the most part, I'm going where I want to go, and I'm taking it at my pace and under my timing. But when you're sitting at the table creating Whiterun, when you go to meet the Thane or whatever, the Jarl, I think it is, in Whiterun, and he's going to give you that first sort of initial quest to go find the first dragon, get Fus Roda, and all this stuff, what happens when 3 of your other players are like distracted and they're like, hold on, I want to talk to the blacksmith. Hold on, is there a thieves guild here? You know, like I've heard of, because I've done research on Google, and I know Elder Scrolls, that there's some Dark Brotherhood element. Are they here? You know, is the Thieves Guild present here? And they want to do these things in game, and the DM is going to have to adjudicate that, and they're going to have to weave through description and narrative and give each person, like I talk about in other videos, ample time, right? But notice the pacing has changed, the flow. Your excitement about going to talk to the Jarl to get the Dragon Quest and start the storyline of the main game and possibly Fus Roda and see what else is out there in the world, that's all changed. What happens if you don't even want to go to Whiterun and you want to go left? You could do that when you're playing Skyrim. And then, hell, you can hit F5, F8, save it, load it, go get a drink, pause the game, stop, go out into, on the road somewhere and stand next to some guards and hope that you're safe and not going to get attacked by some random wolves. And you're good to go make a sandwich, and you're fine. But in the D&D space in 5th edition, at the table that evening, from a player perspective, it's not that smooth. So don't try and translate that same experience. Be inspired by it, but don't translate that, because the gameplay is not going to come out right. And then imagine the pains that the Dungeon Master has to go through. They're not going to be able to calculate that out either, because they just don't know. Does this player A, does Bob want to go left? But does Steve want to go ahead and head directly into Whiterun? But then Sarah, she doesn't want to do either of those. She wants to go back in to the prison area and see if she missed some loot. Right? So just inherently, your experience sitting back reading about any of these worlds, your experience playing any of these games, your experience watching any of those movies, they're your experience. D&D is a cooperative shared experience, so you need to be willing to let go of some of that authority and control over how that experience moves, because you have to account for others' desires, wishes, wants, fears, dislikes, likes. That's the essence of D&D. And notice, it's just D&D. D&D doesn't ever have to be any specific world. So definitely don't confine yourself as a player or DM to the limitations of what the game is presenting you. As open world as a game like a GTA or a Skyrim or a Red Dead Redemption is, it's still confined based on what was programmed, right? The verticality of the game, the scale. D&D, if you're like, I want to go to the damn clouds. I don't know what's there, but I've heard of cloud giants. Let's go to the clouds. If your Skyrim game doesn't account for that, it's never going to line up. So be careful with copying off of things like a Skyrim, like a video game, okay? And then the last one, we're going to look at another video game, which is Azeroth. And this one, the sort of single point, the theme, the word I want to lean into is intensity. Okay? And for that, I'll very simply say, for those that have played, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Your 10v10, I think it was, Warsong Gulch PvP, a battleground, right? The gates open up, and you run out, and you're ready to meet in the center, or you've got a couple, the paladin and whoever else is a good flag carrier going off to the right, whatever. You just want to kill things, so you're the hunter. You got your pet, okay? And you run forward, and you hit, I don't know what edition I'm talking, PvP or whatever, but you hit a button, and it's the big red pet. The pet goes completely nuts. Your Beast Mastery final talent, whatever. The pet goes nuts. Is unstoppable machine of whirlwind of death, and here comes the freaking T-Rex. And it's basically going to solo the priest that's over there, right? And then the priest goes to mind control you, or I don't know what they're going to do. They're going to fear this, or they're going to put a bubble on and go run towards their tank over there. And then all of a sudden on screen, you're playing this in D&D. You're inspired. Dude, I just played Battlegrounds last night. Hey, Mr. DM, can we maybe play something where like half the table is playing Alliance and the other half is playing Horde? And maybe we're having like this PvP element. And let's like go into Warsong Gulch and, and then really make it Azeroth. And then maybe we're only taking place, we're only doing stuff in Kalimdor only. We're not going on any other continent. And I want it to be just like the game was. But what happens is when you do that little situation of PvP at the table, your big pet of death is going across the battlefield, and then boom, it just stops. And imagine on screen it says, please wait, your initiative is not up yet. Your pet will engage in 4 minutes. And then you're sitting there pressing buttons and nothing's working. What the hell? What's going on? Think about that for just a second. That would suck in a game, right? Like, what the hell? 3 minutes? Really? 4 minutes? But in D&D, hell, I play 8 to 10 players. You want to do something really cool, tell me what you want to do in combat. That intensity of PvP, Warsong Gulch, right? The gates opened. It's time to go. We're meeting in the battlefield. I see them all coming. Here it comes. Palm Pyro. Mage is flying across, the big giant fireballs flying across the battlefield. Here come 2 hunter pets. Night Elf is hiding in the tree, shooting you with a bow. It's on. In D&D timing, 5th edition, that's initiative. Roll initiative. Let's see when you go. Okay, it's your turn. You've moved already. You've used your action. Are you a rogue? What other actions do you have that require a bonus action? If you don't have anything, you're done. Whatever other cool buttons you want to push, you need to wait till it's your turn again. 8 to 10 players, that's 5, 6, 7 minutes. 5, 6, 7 minutes before you get to do your cool thing again. But yet the intensity of gameplay in playing World of Warcraft Battlegrounds, it's a hell of a lot much more faster paced, right? And that's just Warcraft. Imagine in a game like Overwatch or a game like, Counter-Strike. I mean, the speed of a game like that versus WoW PvP where there's kind of a global cooldown and, you know what I mean? The speed of the game is not that fast. But it all just doesn't translate well. So the short answer to the 22-minute ramble here, which I don't know that there was ever a question asked, it's just a discussion point, I guess, right? Is tread lightly when you're super excited about a game, a world, a movie, a story, a novel. How cool that would be to play it. I'm here to completely pour out your half cup, your half full glass, and just spill all that water on the floor and tell you it doesn't turn out as cool as you think. Otherwise, it would have been done a long time ago. We don't need Forgotten Realms. We don't need Waterdeep. We don't need Greyhawk. We don't need Wildmount. We don't need Eberron. We don't need Ravnica. When you already have Hyborian Agent Conan. When you already have Narnia. When you already have Azeroth. When you already have the Book of the Fallen Empire of Malazan, right? You already have Middle-earth. So why aren't all those... I mean, they're considered, Westeros. Harry Potter, let's say. You already have some of the coolest wizard schools and most well-thought-out, established, detailed, like them or not. There's a wealth of material and content on that stuff. So why not create a fantasy game? I mean, hell, I'm assuming a lot of D&D's designers are inspired by the same things we are. Why not create those worlds? Because it never translates. It never does. And that's not even talking about nostalgia and what it was like the first time you witnessed, you first ran through Barrens when WoW first came out in 2004. And that's my sign. I'll see you guys soon.